couple of weeks ago, there was some real excitement here at the Pioneer Mine Museum and Heritage Center. Former Ely resident Renee "Scooby" Baumeier works for North Shore Track Services out of Duluth and was able to make some connections in order to find this old ore car, DM&IR ore car, that was in use from the 40s until the 50s and into the 60s. Some of them even made it later than that into the 70s and 80s. I, in particular, am very interested in this because in the summer of 1977, I worked in Marble, Minnesota at the Arcturus mine as a summer replacement at U.S. Steel. And I spent the whole summer working with these cars in several different capacities. This particular car, and we can see by the numbers that are on it, was manufactured in 1948 and probably used for 25 to 30 years. Several different entities combined to make this project happen. It started, as far as Renee was concerned, with her company in Duluth, but they also involved then Canadian National, and just to make sure I catch everybody here, the Canadian National Railroad, North Shore Track Services, Raditich Incorporated, and Louis Lustig and Sons Forest Concrete Products here in Ely. Between donations and volunteerism from those particular companies, this project was able to be completed. As I mentioned earlier, I worked as a summer replacement for U.S. Steel and the last natural ore mine in Minnesota. Basically, when you worked as a summer replacement, you did mostly labor. You might work on the track gang, repairing tracks that came into the property. You might work down in the pit, hauling cable for the electric shovels so that when they move from one area to another, you would drag the cables and get it set up so that they had electricity supplied to them. You might work in the mill, where you might do anything from cleaning up spills to hosing down concrete floors to acting as an operator's helper in order to make sure that there was somebody on the machines at all times. Today we see the ore being taken out of the pit and processed into what are called taconite pellets. They refine it down and combine it with some clay in order to make pellets that transport easily and have a high concentration of iron in them so that when they go to the blast furnaces, they have a product that's going to be consistent. Back in the natural ore days, the ore would be taken out of the pit and brought up to the mill, and in the mill it would either be crushed down into rocks that were approximately this size, which is called coarse ore, or it was refined down further through a water-based system to very fine material. That fine material would be the consistency of about beach sand. And then from there, it would be put into these cars and hauled to the docks down in Duluth or in Silver Bay, and then would be loaded onto ships, taken to the blast furnaces in the eastern part of the U.S., and then converted to steel. In the summer of 1977, when I went to work for the Arcturus mine, I started out and I was offered a job working in the rail yard under the pockets where the ore was loaded into the cars. Now, it was still considered labor, but because of the dangerous nature of riding these cars, being around these cars, and then if you add in some shift differential for either afternoon shift or night shift, as far as labor was concerned, it was one of the highest paying labor jobs at the time. This was considered the most dangerous job in open pit mining at that time. As a matter of fact, the year before I worked there, there were two workers that actually were killed riding cars. And so, as my foreman put it to me, when they offered me the job, It was under a situation where I didn't have to take it. Normally, if a foreman would offer you a job that would increase in pay or increase in status, you would have to accept it, otherwise they wouldn't come back and see you again. But if they offered you the job of writing cars, if you refused it, the foreman said, we won't hold that against you. We understand what the situation is there, and if you don't take it, we won't hold it against you. Next time there's another opportunity for a class improvement, going up a step or two, we'll come back and ask you again. The first week that I was there, I started by doing what was called barking cars. There was a platform on the backside of the cars, especially the ones that held the fines, but with the course as well. And the U.S. Steel had an arrangement with Bland and Paper Company where they would take the bark that Bland and Paper Company would take from the trees and would normally be discarded as trash or burned. And it would bring them over to the U.S. Steel, we would put them up on that platform, and then with a pitchfork, I would take those bark shreddings and I would throw them into the bottom of this car. As you can see, there's a wide gap in the doors at the bottom, and with the fine ore in particular, but even with the coarse ore, there would be a lot of leakage. And so by barking the bottom of that car, that would prevent most of that leakage from happening. In the days before Bland and Paper Company supplied the bark, they used to use hay to do the same job. So if you talk to some of the old miners, the old people that worked in the 50s and the 60s, they may refer to it as haying cars, but when I did it, it was called barking cars. And again, I worked at that for about a week, and after a week, when I kind of understood what was happening in the yard, then they asked me if I wanted to do what was called writing cars, which I'll describe to you now. All of these cars have two braking systems. The first is an air brake system, which goes with a hookup from car to car and then to the engine, and that the engineer is able to, as they try to bring the train to a stop, control all the cars at one time and set brakes by use of an air system. The other is by hand brake. The hand brake is controlled by a wheel up at the top of the car, and it needs to have a person up there to control that wheel, to set the brake, tighten it up, slow the car down, or to release it and let the car roll. And when you rode cars, that was your job. You would ride, you would go up onto the platform, and you would release that brake to start it in motion, and then you would control the speed and eventually stop it by turning the wheel to the right in order to apply the mechanical brakes. The trains would come in twice a shift, and they would bring empty cars into the yard, and they would push them past the pockets onto an incline. So when the cars were released, they were at an incline like this instead of flat like railroad tracks normally are. After they would push them up the hill, the brakeman would come out and he would set the brakes on these, and he would also split them up into strings of either 3 cars or 5 cars. And what would go from there is that they would be shunted to 2 different tracks, one that would come under a pocket that held ore from the mill, that was either the coarse ore that would go into a string of 5 cars, or a fine ore, a separate pocket, a separate set of tracks that would go into the 3-car strings. When the person riding the cars was called by the pocket engineer, the pocket manager, was either 1 blast of the horn for the coarse load, or 2 blasts of the horn for the fine load. You'd walk up the hill and you take the corresponding 3-car or 5-car string, go up on top, release the brake. There's a little lever on there that you would move to the side, and then that would release that brake. The brake wheel would turn and the car would start moving. As it started to move, you would slowly apply the brake and control the speed until you got the first car under the pocket, and then you would apply the brake hard so that it would stop there. Then, once the car was under, or the cars were underneath the pocket, then you would hook up the air brake, and the operator of the pockets up above would then control the cars as they went through the pockets. They didn't want men actually going through in case there was an accidental dump and they'd get crushed by the material coming out of the pockets. They would fill 1 car, 2 cars, 3 cars on the one side, up to 5 cars on the other side, and then run them out the side from underneath the pockets, and then we'd unhook the air brake, and then we'd get back on and ride them down to where the loaded cars were stored until the engines came in later in the shift. As far as safety equipment, normal safety equipment that everybody in the mines had to have was a helmet, safety glasses, boots that had steel toes and what are called metatarsal guards. We weren't allowed to wear any jewelry. We couldn't wear wristwatches, necklaces, rings, because going up and down on these things, if you happen to catch something, it could injure you, and so we couldn't have any of that on there. We were issued a belt. It was a web type belt that clipped on, and it had a short rope with a hook on it, so that once you got up on top, you would hook that into the car, and if there was a problem, as often happened with these, and the car got away from you, you wouldn't fall off the car. You might be hung by that belt, which wasn't very comfortable, but it was better than the alternative as far as falling to the ground and maybe hitting your head on the rail or breaking an arm or whatever as you fell down. Brakes on these things, especially with the older cars that were 15, 20, 25 years old or more, were somewhat iffy. They worked most of the time, but once in a while, for whatever reason, the brake was not very good, and those cars could get away from you. They would start to roll, and when you try to slow the speed down with the handbrake, they would just keep right on rolling. In which case, company policy was you were to ride that car until it came to a stop at the loaded string of cars down below the pockets. Well, that usually meant quite a jolt, but that web belt was there in order to keep you again from falling off when an accident like that happened. There were 2 accidents the year before I worked at Marble. One was from a runaway car. The guy on there decided that he was going to jump instead of keep the belt hooked in, and when he jumped, he lost his balance and did land on the rail, and even with the helmet on, which obviously came off from that accident, had some head injuries that caused him to become deceased. The other one, on the ends of the cars, the couplers that connect one car to another are called knuckles, and they come together like this. And unbelievably, these cars are very quiet when they start moving on their own without being pushed by an engine. And when those things would start rolling down that incline, sometimes they made no noise at all. And on a particular day, this other guy was walking between 2 strings of cars, didn't realize that the car on the above part of the incline had been released, and he happened to be just in the right spot at the right time and got caught mid-body where these couplers were, and the couplers coupled inside of him. And so that was some of the problems that could happen here, and consequently the increase in pay and the realization that if you were asked to do this and you said no, it wasn't going to be held against you. It was just one of those things that was one of the more dangerous things in mining at that time. Unbelievably, these cars could be absolutely quiet, dead quiet, when they were rolling down those inclines. And sometimes gravity didn't do its job the way it should. If you get up on top and release the brake, and it wouldn't move. So we'd have to take one of these, we call them pinchers. It long wooden handle, it's got a little bit of a mechanism down in the bottom, and you would set these underneath the wheel, and by pressing down on this, that would just give a little bit of an impetus to that wheel to get it started rolling, and then you'd have to run out of there, run up the side of the car onto the stairs and get over there and be ready to set the brake before it got rolling too fast. The end of my summer of writing cars, the last 2 weeks before my term was going to be done, I worked on these cars in a little different manner. I was called a biller sampler, and my job was to wait till the cars were loaded, came down to the yard, and then I had a little shack out there all by myself, and I would take a canvas bag and a little scoop shovel, and I would climb up to the top and I would take samples of the ore and then have to make note of the number on the side of the ore car as well as the number on the bag, and then that would be sent into research and or another place where they would test it for iron content, and then they would keep track of train by train by train how much good ore they had. That last year that I worked at the Arcturus, again, it was natural ore, and they had some very rich natural ore that they were trying to get as much as they could. And that ran about 60% iron. The ore would be about 60% iron, which is about what the taconite pellets that they have today run once they are processed and refined. So that's where we're at with that. When you look at the economy for that time compared to today, it sounds like we made a lot less money, but things cost a lot less at the same time. I worked for about 12 weeks that summer for U.S. Steel, and in that time I made enough money to buy a brand new pickup truck off the lot, 1978 model in the fall of 1977. Brand new Ford F-150, first new vehicle I'd ever had, and I paid for it in cash. So it was good wages for the time. It really was. So.
Yeah. So that car was made in June of 1948.
Okay.
That was a class U-24. So that meant it was bought in a batch of cars in 1948.
Okay.
So they buy in batches like U-23, U-24, U-25, U-26.
Okay.
So, yeah, so
okay.
that car is basically what it should be, because it isn't modified with sideboards or anything.
Sure,
so,
sure.
I mean, that's basically the car you rode on.
Yep, yep.